In tonight's video, we're traveling back in time to explore what people ate across different eras and cultures, how they prepared their meals, and which flavors were surprisingly familiar, and which ones might shock us today. From simple breads and stews to meals shaped by seasons, survival, and tradition, food tells a powerful story about how people lived. If you enjoy calm, thoughtful history that's easy to relax to, make sure to like this video. It truly helps the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more peaceful journeys into the past, and check out the related videos for even more stories waiting for you. Now get comfortable, and let's take a bite out of history and discover what people ate before modern food. Imagine sitting down for a meal long before supermarkets, refrigerators, or takeout menus ever existed. No packaged snacks, no sugar-loaded drinks, just the foods people could grow, gather, hunt, or trade. So what did everyday meals really look like before modern food changed everything? Before recipes, before kitchens, before the idea of dinner, there was only hunger. Not the dramatic kind we imagine today. Not the movie hunger where someone clutches their stomach and collapses at sunset. This was quieter, constant, a low, steady pressure that followed people from the moment they woke up until they fell asleep again. Hunger wasn't an emergency. It was the normal state of things. For prehistoric humans, eating was not a hobby or a pleasure. It was a task, a daily problem that needed solving with whatever the land was willing to give up that day. There were no meals, no breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Food appeared when it appeared. If it didn't, you waited. Hunter-gatherer diets were shaped entirely by seasons. Spring meant roots and early plants. Summer brought berries, insects, and small animals. Autumn was the brief moment of abundance, when nuts and fruit could be stored, when animals were fat, when people ate as much as they could because winter was coming and everyone knew it. Winter was thin, quiet, hungry. What people ate depended on where they lived, but the pattern stayed the same. Roots dug from hard ground, leaves that didn't kill you, insects picked off bark or shaken from branches, eggs stolen from nests, small animals caught by hand or trap. When larger animals were killed, nothing went to waste. Meat, yes, but also organs, marrow, brains, blood. The parts we now avoid were often the most valuable. Calories mattered more than flavor. Fat mattered more than comfort. A successful hunt didn't mean a nice dinner. It meant survival for a few more days. And hunts failed more often than they succeeded. Animals ran faster. Weapons broke. Weather changed. Sometimes you tracked something for hours and came back with nothing but sore legs and empty hands. When food did come, it came all at once. This is where the feast and famine cycle ruled life. People ate until they were full, then kept eating. Not because they were greedy, but because the body understood something the mind didn't need explaining. You eat now because you don't know when you'll eat again. Starvation was not rare. It wasn't dramatic either. It was expected. Children learned early what an empty stomach felt like. Adults planned their days around it. Elders knew it best of all. We like to imagine natural diets as clean and balanced. They weren't. They were exhausting. Finding food meant walking long distances, digging, climbing, stalking, waiting. Every calorie eaten had already cost energy, sometimes more energy than it gave back, and food was rarely cooked the way we think of cooking. Fire existed, but fuel wasn't free. Many things were eaten raw or barely heated. Tough roots chewed slowly, meat gnawed from bone, organs eaten quickly before they spoiled. There were no spices to hide taste, no sugar to soften bitterness. You ate what you found, and you accepted how it tasted. Sometimes what you ate fought back. Plants could poison you, insects could sting, meat could carry parasites. People learned through trial, error, and loss. Someone ate the wrong berry, someone didn't come back. The knowledge stayed, the cost was human. Even water wasn't safe. Rivers carried disease, standing pools bred sickness. Beer and fermentation came much later. For now, you drank what you could and hoped your body handled it. There was no concept of healthy eating. There was only eating that kept you alive, and eating that didn't. Children grew up smaller than we expect. Bones show signs of stress, hunger, injury. Teeth wore down fast, not from sugar, but from grit. Dirt stuck to roots, sand mixed with food. Chewing was work. And still, this life lasted for tens of thousands of years. Not because it was easy, but because humans adapted. They learned where food appeared. They followed animals. They memorized seasons. They shared. Sharing mattered. One successful hunt could feed many, but only if food moved through the group. Hoarding meant death later. Cooperation meant survival. There was humor too, probably more than we imagine. People joked. They complained about tough meat. They laughed when someone dropped food in the dirt and picked it up anyway, because of course they did. Hunger doesn't erase humor. It sharpens it. But make no mistake, this was not a peaceful life of abundance. It was a careful balance between energy gained and energy spent, between risk and reward, between today and tomorrow was never promised. This is why the idea of farming would later feel like a miracle. The idea that food could stay in one place, that it could be grown, stored, counted, that hunger might be controlled. It wasn't true, not really. But compared to this, compared to waking every day and asking the land a question it might refuse to answer, it felt like progress. Prehistoric people did not eat for pleasure. They ate to stay upright, to walk another mile, to see another season, to keep children alive long enough to learn how hunger worked. Food was not culture yet. It was not identity. It was not art. It was uncertain hope, and every bite mattered. At some point, humans decided to stop chasing food and make it wait for them. This sounds smart, revolutionary, even in many ways it was, but it also changed hunger forever, not in the way people expected. Early agriculture didn't begin with comfort or abundance. It began with fear. Fear of winter, fear of empty landscapes, fear of not finding enough tomorrow. The idea was simple. If plants could be grown close to home, food might become predictable, so people settled. They stopped moving. They chose certain plants, wheat, barley, millet, focused on them almost obsessively. These plants were not chosen because they tasted good. They were chosen because they could be dried, stored, and survived long enough to matter. Grain doesn't spoil quickly if kept dry. That single fact changed human history, but it came with a cost. Farming demanded routine. Fields had to be cleared, planted, weeded, harvested. This was not lighter work than hunting and gathering. It was harder in many ways, bending for hours, repeating the same motion day after day, carrying heavy loads. And unlike hunting, the payoff was delayed. Months of work stood between effort and food. When harvests failed, they failed completely. Bread became the center of life, not the soft bread we know now. This was dense, dark, heavy bread, sometimes more like a brick than a loaf. It filled the stomach, which mattered more than anything else. Chewing it took effort, digesting it took time, but it kept people alive. Grinding grain was brutal work. Stones crushed wheat into flour, but they also crushed everything else with it. Tiny bits of stone, sand, dust, all of it ended up in the bread. Teeth paid the price. Skeletons from early farming communities show extreme dental wear, even in young adults. People in their 20s had mouths that looked decades older. This was not a coincidence. This was daily bread, and bread became food in the most narrow sense of the word. It didn't mean variety. It meant sameness, day after day, morning and night. Bread, porridge, gruel. Grain boiled into something that barely changed from one meal to the next. Protein dropped, vitamins dropped, diversity disappeared. Early farmers were often shorter, weaker, and sicker than the hunter-gatherers who came before them. Bones show signs of malnutrition, iron deficiency, childhood stress, infection. Agriculture increased population, but it did not improve individual health. It just kept more people alive at once. Hunger didn't go away, it became scheduled. Instead of wondering if food would appear today, people worried whether the harvest would last the year, whether rats would get into storage, whether rain would come at the wrong time, whether frost would arrive early. Hunger shifted from daily uncertainty to seasonal dread. And when hunger arrived now, it arrived for everyone. There was no moving on to another valley, no following herds. Fields tied people to land, and land could betray them. A single bad year could undo generations of work. Bread was survival food, not comfort food. It was eaten not because it was good, but because it was there. Sometimes it wasn't even fully baked. Sometimes it was mixed with whatever could stretch it further: wild seeds, husks, crushed roots. The goal was bulk. Calories first, everything else later. Communities began to organize around grain. Storage became power. Those who controlled granaries controlled survival. This is where hierarchy quietly grew. Someone guarded the grain. Someone counted it. Someone decided who received it when supplies ran thin. Hunger became managed, and management meant control. Even beer began as bread in another form. Fermented grain was safer to drink than water and easier to store than food. It was thick, cloudy, low in alcohol, more like liquid bread than drink. Children drank it, workers drank it. It wasn't for pleasure, it was nutrition. You didn't have to chew. But fermentation didn't solve everything. Mold still grew, grain still spoiled. And when people ate bad bread, they didn't know why they got sick. They only knew that sometimes food betrayed them. There was also monotony, a deep, grinding monotony. Imagine eating the same base food every day for your entire life. No spices, no sweetness, no contrast. Just grain, again and again, shaped slightly differently, so it didn't feel exactly the same. This kind of diet wears on the mind as much as the body. You can survive on it, but you don't thrive. You endure, and endurance became the goal of civilization. The cracked stone mill is a good symbol here. It turns endlessly. Someone pushes it every day. Grain goes in, flour comes out. The motion never changes. The person does. Hands grow rough, backs curve. Time becomes measured, not by seasons, but by meals that all look the same. Still, people clung to farming because despite everything, it offered one powerful illusion: control. You could point to a field and say, "This will feed us." You could count sacks and feel safer, even if the safety was fragile, even if one storm could undo it. Bread didn't end hunger, it redefined it. Hunger was no longer the absence of food today. It was the fear of running out tomorrow. And once that fear took root, it never really left. Once food could be stored, counted, and guarded, it stopped being just food. It became a line. On one side of that line were people who worried about whether they would eat. On the other side were people who worried about what they would eat. This is where food stopped being equal. In almost every civilization that followed agriculture, diet became a clear marker of class. You could tell where someone stood in society by what was on their plate or what wasn't. For most people, food was simple and repetitive. Peasants, laborers, servants, and slaves ate what was cheap, filling, and available. This usually meant some form of grain, bread, porridge, gruel, whatever you want to call it. It was the same idea: boiled plants that took up space in the stomach. Gruel wasn't meant to be tasty. It was meant to stop hunger from hurting. Sometimes it was thick. Sometimes it was thin enough to drink. When supplies were good, it might include vegetables or a bit of fat. When times were bad, it was grain and water and nothing else. Meat was rare, very rare. Not once a week rare, more like a few times a year rare. When animals were kept, they were more valuable alive than dead. A goat gave milk, a chicken laid eggs. Killing them meant losing future food. Meat was usually eaten only when an animal was injured, old, or part of a festival. And even then, the best parts didn't go to everyone. The poor ate scraps. Bones after the marrow was gone. Skin, fat, if they were lucky. Organs, which were sometimes considered low-status food, even though they were often the most nutritious. Meanwhile, the powerful ate differently. They had access to meat more often. Fresh meat. They ate animals raised specifically to be eaten. They had bread made from finer flour, without as much grit and dirt. They had access to salt, honey, wine, and later, sugar. Things that didn't just fill the stomach, but changed how food felt. Spices mattered here too, but we'll get to that later. What matters now is that food became a performance. Banquets were not just meals, they were statements. Tables overloaded with food showed wealth, control, and security. The ability to waste food to leave leftovers was a kind of power. For the poor, leftovers didn't exist. Everything was eaten. If something fell on the ground, it was picked up. If it smelled a little off, it was cooked longer. If it still tasted bad, you swallowed it anyway. Hunger makes you flexible. In many societies, laws actually regulated food. Some foods were reserved for certain classes. Certain animals could only be eaten by nobles. Certain spices were restricted. Sumptuary laws told people what they were allowed to wear, and sometimes what they were allowed to eat. Food was used to remind people of their place. This wasn't subtle. If you ate white bread instead of dark bread, people noticed. If you drank wine instead of watered-down beer, people noticed. If you ate meat often, people knew you had money or power or both. And hunger became a tool. Rations could be cut. Access could be denied. During hard times, elites often protected their own food supplies first. Granaries were guarded. Prices rose. The poor were told to wait, pray, endure. They did, because they had no choice. The contrast was sharpest during feasts. Imagine standing outside a hall while music played and food piled high inside. Roasted animals, bread soaked in fat, wine flowing freely. Inside, people ate slowly, talked, laughed. Outside, people waited for scraps, or nothing. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was structure, hierarchy made visible through food. And yet, even the powerful were not as safe as we imagine. Their food spoiled too. Their meat carried disease. Their wine turned sour. They got food poisoning just like everyone else. But they had variety, and variety changes everything. If one food failed, there was another. If one crop spoiled, trade could replace it. The poor had no backup plan. A bad harvest didn't mean inconvenience. It meant starvation. Bread got smaller. Gruel got thinner. Children got quieter. People learned to stretch food in ways that feel shocking now. Adding water, adding filler, eating things they normally wouldn't. Sometimes the powerful noticed. Sometimes they didn't. And sometimes hunger turned loud. Food riots were common throughout history. When bread prices rose too high, people didn't politely complain. They gathered. They shouted. They overturned carts. Because bread wasn't optional. It was life. These riots weren't about luxury. They were about survival. About the line between endurance and collapse. The powerful often responded with force, or speeches, or promises, rarely with more food. Still, the system held. It always does, until it doesn't. What's important to understand is that this divide shaped how people thought about food itself. The poor didn't dream of fancy meals. They dreamed of enough, of eating without counting, of not feeling hunger as soon as they woke up. The powerful thought about taste, about presentation, about novelty. They got bored of food, which is a very specific kind of privilege. And humor existed here too, in small ways. Jokes about watery soup, complaints about tough bread, songs about hunger, dark humor, but humor all the same. When you can't change your situation, you laugh at it. For most of human history, food was not a shared experience across society. It was a divider, a daily reminder of who mattered more. And this wasn't temporary. It wasn't a flaw to be fixed later. It was baked into how civilizations worked. The banquet hall and the cold one-room hut existed at the same time, often just streets apart. One smelled of roasted meat and wine. The other smelled of damp grain and smoke. Both were part of the same world, and the distance between them was measured in meals. If you lived in ancient Egypt, food was everywhere, and somehow, still exhausting. The Nile flooded every year. It left behind rich black soil that made crops grow easily compared to most places on Earth. From a distance, Egypt looked like a food miracle. Grain fields stretched along the river, storehouses filled up. Boats moved bread and barley up and down the Nile like clockwork. But daily eating was far less glamorous than the murals make it seem. For most Egyptians, life revolved around two things: bread and beer, not as treats, as necessities. These were not side items. They were the diet. Bread was eaten at every meal. Dense, coarse bread, often misshapen, sometimes underbaked, sometimes burned. It was made from immer wheat or barley, ground between stones. And this is where Egypt's food problem quietly ruined teeth. Grinding stones shed grit. Sand blew in from everywhere. The flour was never clean. Every loaf contained tiny bits of stone. You couldn't see them, but your teeth could feel them. Chewing bread in ancient Egypt was like chewing very fine sandpaper every single day. Skeletons tell this story clearly. Teeth worn flat, exposed nerves, abscesses, infections, pain that never really stopped. Dentistry did not exist. You just lived with it, or didn't. Bread wasn't soft comfort food. It was survival compressed into a loaf. Beer was just as important. And no, it wasn't beer like today. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol. More like fermented grain soup. People drank it all day, including children. Not to relax, to hydrate. Water from the Nile carried disease. Beer was safer. Fermentation killed some of the worst things. So beer became liquid bread. Calories you could drink. Nutrition that didn't hurt your teeth quite as much. An Egyptian laborer might receive daily rations of bread and beer instead of money. This wasn't symbolic. It was practical. You couldn't eat coins. Vegetables filled in the gaps when available. Onions, garlic, leeks, lentils. Simple things. Strong-smelling things. These weren't garnish. They were the main source of flavor. And honestly, probably the main defense against boredom. Fruit existed, but it was seasonal. Dates were common. Figs' sweetness was rare enough to matter. Meat, however, was not common. Despite all the paintings of banquets and roasted animals, most Egyptians rarely ate meat. Animals were valuable alive. Cows plowed fields, goats gave milk, chickens laid eggs. Killing them meant losing long-term food for short-term calories. Meat was for festivals, offerings, or the elite. When regular people ate meat, it was often fish. The Nile provided plenty of it. Fish was cheaper, more accessible, and didn't require slaughtering a working animal. But fish came with its own risks. Spoilage happened fast in the heat. Preservation methods were basic. Salting helped, but only if done well. People got sick, a lot. Still, fish was eaten constantly. Dried, salted, or fresh when possible. It smelled. It always smelled. You just accepted that. Eggs were eaten when found. Milk was consumed fresh or turned into simple cheese, though dairy spoiled quickly. There was no refrigeration. Once food turned, you cooked it harder and hoped for the best. Cooking did not mean safety. It meant effort. Ovens were small and hot. Fires burned constantly. Kitchens were smoky, crowded, and dirty. Bread was baked in molds or directly on hot surfaces. Sometimes the mold stuck. Sometimes it broke. Sometimes bits of ash ended up in the loaf. Nobody cared. You brushed it off and ate. Because food was not about enjoyment. It was about keeping the body moving. Workers on massive projects like temples or pyramids were fed heavily in bread and beer. Not out of kindness, but necessity. Hungry workers don't work. That's one lesson history learned early. Still, even with steady rations, people were not well fed by modern standards. Protein was low. Vitamins were inconsistent. Illness was common. Life expectancy was short. And yet, Egypt felt stable. That's the strange part. Compared to many other ancient societies, Egypt had fewer catastrophic famines. The Nile's rhythm created a sense of reliability. Floods came, crops grew, granaries filled. When things worked, they really worked. When they didn't, things collapsed quickly. A failed flood meant hunger. A series of bad floods meant starvation. Grain prices rose. Bread shrank. Beer thinned. The same foods were still there, just less of them. Hunger didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in. Religion wrapped itself tightly around food. Offerings of bread and beer were given to gods and the dead. Tombs were stocked with food for the afterlife, because nobody trusted that hunger stopped with death. That tells you something important. Even in one of the most food-secure ancient civilizations, people feared running out. There is humor here too, buried in texts and art. Workers complained about rations. Jokes were made about bad bread. People grumbled about bosses skimming supplies. Some things never change, and despite everything, Egyptians were proud of their food. Bread and beer were seen as gifts of the gods. Civilized food, proper food. People beyond Egypt were viewed as eating strangely, badly, incorrectly. Food becomes identity very quickly. But behind that pride was the same truth we've seen before. Eating was repetitive, monotonous, physically damaging, and tied to labor. Every loaf of bread carried sand. Every cup of beer carried grain. Every meal carried the quiet knowledge that tomorrow's food depended on the river behaving itself. Ancient Egypt shows us something important. Abundance does not mean comfort. Stability does not mean health. And having food everywhere does not mean eating well. It just means hunger becomes quieter. Instead of shouting, it whispers. And for most Egyptians, that whisper followed them from the fields, to the ovens, to the riverbanks, and back home again every single day. When people talk about ancient Greece and Rome, they often talk about food like it was a golden age. Olive oil, bread, wine, fresh fruit, long meals under the sun. It sounds healthy. It sounds relaxed. It sounds better than it really was. For most people living in Greece or Rome, food was still about endurance, not pleasure. Yes, the Mediterranean diet existed, but it didn't look like the version printed on modern health blogs. It was simpler, poorer, and much more repetitive. Bread was still the foundation. Thick, dark bread for the poor. Finer white bread for those with money. Bread dipped in olive oil. Bread soaked in watered-down wine. Bread eaten alone when nothing else was available. Olive oil was everywhere, but not in abundance for everyone. It was valuable. It lit lamps. It treated skin. It flavored food. Poor families used it carefully. A little went a long way. Sometimes too long. Wine was not the luxury we imagine either. It was weak, sour, and always diluted with water. Drinking undiluted wine was considered uncivilized. The goal wasn't enjoyment. It was safety. Fermented drinks were safer than water, especially in crowded cities. Most meals were small, very small. A typical working Roman might eat bread, olives, maybe some vegetables, and that was it. Cabbage, onions, beans, lentils, cheap filling foods that kept people moving. Meat was rare, and when it appeared, it was often preserved or low quality. Fresh meat spoiled quickly in warm weather. Without refrigeration, it was risky. People knew this, even if they didn't understand bacteria. If meat smelled wrong, you cooked it harder. If it still tasted strange, you added something strong to cover it up. This is where garum comes in. Garum was a fish sauce made by fermenting fish guts, blood, and salt in the sun. It smelled awful, truly awful, but it was popular across the Roman world. It added salt, flavor, and protein. It also masked the taste of food that was starting to turn. People either loved it or tolerated it. Complaints about its smell show up in ancient writing, which tells us something important. Even then, people knew their food was kind of gross sometimes. Fish was more common than meat, especially for coastal cities. But fish came with parasites, bones, spoilage. It had to be eaten fast or heavily salted. Markets smelled strong, always. You didn't browse food markets. You moved through them quickly. Street food existed, especially in Roman cities. Many people didn't have kitchens. They lived in small apartments, sometimes one room. Cooking fires were dangerous in dense housing, so people bought hot food from stalls. This sounds modern. It wasn't. Street food was cheap, filling, and risky. Stews, bread, beans, bits of meat if available. Nobody asked how fresh it was. You ate it because you were hungry. Food poisoning was common. People accepted it as part of life. Cities were crowded. Sanitation was poor. Water systems helped, but not enough. Illness spread easily. Food didn't cause all of it, but it didn't help. Now, let's talk about the illusion. The elites ate very differently. Banquets in Greece and Rome were famous for excess. Tables covered in food, multiple courses, exotic animals, dishes designed to impress, not nourish. These meals were not everyday eating. They were performances. Writers described food in dramatic detail. Sauces, rare ingredients, animals stuffed inside other animals. The point was shock and novelty. The ability to eat something strange showed wealth and reach. Look how far my food traveled to get here. But even elite food had problems. Too much meat, too much wine, heavy digestion. Gout was common among the rich. Stomach issues, obesity, in a world where most people were thin. Some Roman doctors warned against overeating. Others suggested vomiting between courses so you could eat more. That wasn't a joke. It was advice. The poor watched all of this from a distance. For them, Greece and Rome were not food heavens. They were loud, hungry cities where bread shortages caused riots. When grain shipments were delayed, people panicked. The state knew this. That's why Rome invested heavily in grain imports. The city could not feed itself. It depended on grain from Egypt and North Africa. Bread was politics. Keeping people fed kept them calm. When bread ran out, calm disappeared. Food distributions became common. Free grain rations for citizens, not generosity, stability. Hungry crowds were dangerous. Still, rations were limited. Bread again. Always bread. Vegetables helped when available. Olives were common. Figs when in season. Cheese existed, but spoiled quickly. Milk was not widely consumed by adults. It turned fast and caused illness. So the Mediterranean diet, as lived by most people, was light, repetitive, and often lacking. It kept people alive. Barely. There is humor hidden in ancient complaints. Writers joked about bad bread, about sour wine, about cheap food that sat in the stomach like a stone. Some things really do not change. And yet, Greece and Rome believed they ate well. They believed their food was civilized. That other cultures ate strangely or badly. Food became identity again. Bread and olive oil were symbols of order, of culture, of being proper. This belief didn't come from abundance. It came from comparison. When you eat the same food every day, you don't ask if it's good. You ask if it's normal. And for most Greeks and Romans, this was normal. Bread, oil, wine, vegetables, occasionally fish, rarely meat, always repetition. The illusion of plenty came from the elite, from art, from writing. History remembered the banquets. It forgot the bowls of beans. Because bowls of beans don't look impressive in marble. What Greece and Rome really show us is this. Even advanced civilizations with trade, cities, and culture did not solve food. They managed it. They organized it. They talked about it endlessly. but they still lived close to hunger, close enough to fear it, close enough to riot over it, close enough to remember that food was never guaranteed. Olive oil and wine made life feel refined. Bread made life possible. Everything else was decoration. And beneath the poetry, the philosophy, and the empire, most people still ate the same quiet meal they had yesterday and hoped it would be enough again tomorrow. There were times when food stopped pretending to be food, not because people didn't know better, but because there was nothing else. Scarcity has a way of lowering standards very quickly. When grain ran out, when harvests failed, when war cut off supplies, people didn't ask what tasted good. They asked what could be swallowed without killing them immediately. Sometimes, even that was negotiable. During famines, people ate things that were never meant to be eaten, or things that were only meant to be eaten once, in desperation, and never spoken of again. Tree bark was one of the first options. Not the soft inner bark people imagine, but whatever could be scraped off and ground down. Bark was dried, crushed, and mixed with flour if flour still existed. If not, it was mixed with water and boiled into something that technically counted as food. It had almost no nutrition, but it filled space. Grass followed, leaves, nettles, anything green that didn't immediately poison you. People learned which plants could be boiled enough to stop hurting. Some knowledge was passed down. Some was learned the hard way. Leather came next. Old shoes, belts, straps, animal hides. Leather was boiled for hours, sometimes days, until it softened enough to chew. It tasted like nothing and something awful at the same time. It gave almost no calories, but it tricked the stomach. For a little while, bones were boiled repeatedly, not once, over and over. Each time, hoping a little more marrow or grease would come out. The pot would be cloudy, greasy, sad, but people drank it anyway. Blood was collected when animals were slaughtered. It was cooked into soups or mixed with grain. Blood is nutritious. That's the part people don't like to admit. When food is scarce, blood makes sense. But scarcity rarely stops at sensible. Dirt ended up in bread, not by accident, on purpose. Clay chalk, ash mixed in to make loaves larger, heavier, more filling. It destroyed teeth. It blocked digestion. It made people sick. But it stretched food just a little longer. Sawdust flour appeared in desperate times. Would ground fine enough to disappear into dough. It passed through the body without helping. Sometimes it caused blockages, sometimes worse. But hunger doesn't care about later. Hunger only cares about now. These foods were not normal. They were emergency measures. But emergencies happened often enough that these practices appear again and again in historical records. Famines were not rare disasters. They were regular events. People knew this. That's why they experimented. That's why they wrote lists of edible things that weren't really edible. Knowledge meant survival, even if survival looked thin and painful. There was also a social side to this kind of eating. When people ate barely food, they often did it together. Not because it was enjoyable, but because suffering alone is harder. Pots were shared. Whatever went into them went in for everyone. Equality didn't mean fairness. It meant shared misery. And there was shame. People didn't like to talk about these foods later. Eating bark or leather was remembered quietly, if at all. It marked failure of weather, of rulers, of systems. Histories written by elites skipped these meals whenever possible. But bones remember. Teeth remember. Archaeology fills in what words avoid. There are mass graves tied to famine. There are skeletons showing signs of long-term malnutrition. There are documents listing prices of food substitutes as they rise, which tells us people were buying them. You don't buy sawdust unless you're desperate. There's dark humor here too, because humans never lose it completely. Jokes about wooden bread, complaints about soup that tasted like dirt, because it literally did. Songs about hunger, bitter laughter. Humor didn't fix anything, but it made time pass. Not everyone survived these periods. Children suffered the most. Elderly people faded quickly. The sick didn't last long. Hunger selects quietly. It doesn't announce who it will take. What's important to understand is that these foods weren't eaten because people were ignorant or uncivilized. They were eaten because people were adaptable, because they refused to stop trying. This adaptability kept populations alive through repeated collapse, through wars, plagues, climate shifts. Every time food systems broke, people lowered the bar and kept going. Modern people often say, "I could never eat that." That's probably not true. Given enough hunger, standards change fast. Taste disappears as a concern. Texture becomes negotiable. Smell becomes background noise. What matters is whether your body keeps working another day. And most of the time, it did. Barely. These moments of extreme scarcity also changed how people thought about real food. Bread became sacred, not because it tasted good, but because it was not bark, not leather, not dirt. Anything that was truly food felt precious afterward. This is why so many cultures treated bread with reverence, kissed it when it fell, saved crumbs, scolded children for wasting it. These habits weren't symbolic, they were memories. Memories of when bread disappeared. Food that was barely food taught people where the edge was, how far the body could be pushed, how thin life could get and still continue. It also taught something else. That hunger was not a personal failure. It was structural, environmental, political. When food systems collapsed, everyone below a certain level suffered, no matter how hard they worked or how carefully they planned. This knowledge didn't make life fair, but it made it understandable. So when better times returned, people didn't forget. They stored food, they hoarded, they feared waste. They cooked strange things just in case, because once you've eaten things that were never meant to be eaten, you don't trust abundance easily. You eat while you can. You save what you can. You remember how close the edge really is. And the edge, for most of history, was never very far away. If you lived in medieval Europe, your food probably came from one place. A pot, not a clean, shiny pot that got washed every night. A heavy, blackened pot that hung over the fire day after day. It was used so often it barely cooled down, and whatever went into it became dinner. This was pottage was not a recipe. It was a method, a way of turning almost anything into something you could eat with a spoon. Grain, vegetables, herbs, scraps of meat if you were lucky, water if you weren't. Everything went into the same pot and stayed there for hours, sometimes days. When people say medieval food was boring, this is what they mean. For most families, pottage was eaten once or twice a day, thick enough to fill the stomach, thin enough to stretch. The goal was not flavor. The goal was patience. You ate what the land gave you. Cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans. These were reliable. They grew even when conditions were bad. They could survive cold and damp. They were not exciting, but they showed up. Grain still mattered most. Oats, barley, rye, wheat if you were well off. Grain was boiled into the pot, thickening it, making it heavier. Bread often accompanied pottage, used to scoop it up. Sometimes bread was the meal and pottage was the side. Sometimes it was the other way around. Meat was rare. Again, when it appeared, it was usually small amounts. Bits of pork fat, a bone with some meat still clinging to it, salted or smoked if possible. Meat flavored the pot more than it filled it, and when the meat was gone, the pot stayed. This is important. The pot was never really emptied. New ingredients were added as old ones were eaten. The pottage evolved slowly. Today's meal carried traces of yesterday's meal, sometimes of last week's meal. This sounds unsafe. It often was. Spoilage was accepted as normal. Food turning slightly sour wasn't a reason to throw it out. It was a reason to boil it longer. Heat was the answer to everything. Bad smell, boil it. Weird taste, boil it more. If you got sick, that was unfortunate, but not surprising. Medieval people did not expect food to be safe. They expected it to be tolerable. Hunger was woven into daily life, and the church played a big role in how people thought about it. Hunger was not just physical, it was moral. Fasting was encouraged. Enduring hunger was seen as virtuous. Saints starved themselves. Sermons praised restraint. Feeling hungry was sometimes framed as good for the soul. This worked out nicely for a society that often didn't have enough food anyway. People were told that wanting more was sinful, that suffering patiently brought spiritual reward, that food was temporary, but faith was eternal. These ideas didn't create hunger, but they helped people live with it. Children learned early not to complain. Complaining didn't fill bowls. Silence did. The rhythm of eating was slow. Meals were not rushed because there was nothing to rush toward. You ate when the pot was ready. You ate until the pot was empty or your portion was gone. Everyone ate together. There were no individual plates for the poor. One bowl, one pot, shared spoons. This wasn't about community spirit. It was about efficiency. If someone dropped food, it was picked up. If someone spilled, it was scraped back in. Waste was unthinkable. Flavor came from herbs when available. Parsley, thyme, sage. Things grown close to home. Spices existed, but not for ordinary people. Most medieval pottage tasted like warm plants and smoke. And yet, People developed preferences. Some liked it thicker, some liked it thinner. Some complained when there wasn't enough salt. Some joked that it tasted the same as yesterday, because it did. There's humor here, buried in medieval writings. Jokes about thin soup, complaints about watery pottage served by stingy landlords, songs about hunger. Again, humor survived where comfort did not. Food also marked time. Festivals meant better food, more bread, maybe meat, maybe cheese. These moments stood out sharply against the usual diet. They mattered because they were rare. You remembered a good meal. You talked about it for weeks. The rest of the time you endured. Nutritional problems were common. Vitamin deficiencies, weak bones, frequent illness. People didn't know why they felt tired or sick. They only knew that everyone else felt the same way. Life expectancy was short, not just because of disease, but because bodies were constantly underfueled. People worked hard on little food. They aged fast. Still, medieval diets were not completely hopeless. They were plant-heavy. They included fiber. They avoided sugar. But the lack of variety hurt. So did the lack of protein and fat. Fat was precious. It meant energy. It meant warmth. When pork fat appeared in the pot, it changed everything. The meal felt richer, more satisfying. People noticed. That tells you a lot. What we call comfort food today often comes from these moments. Thick stews, slow-cooked dishes, one-pot meals. They come from a time when food needed to last, and comfort came from fullness, not excitement. But make no mistake, medieval eating required patience, not just while cooking, but while living. You waited for harvests. You waited for bread to rise. You waited for the pot to boil. You waited for hunger to quiet down enough to sleep. This waiting shaped how people thought, about time, about desire, about expectation. Food was not something you looked forward to. It was something you managed. And when times were bad, even pottage failed. Pots grew emptier, bowls grew thinner. Hunger returned to the foreground. But when times were average, when nothing went terribly wrong, pottage did its job. It kept people alive, not strong, not well fed, but upright. And upright was enough. The medieval bowl tells us something simple and important. Civilization did not bring variety to most people's plates. It brought routine, predictability, a slow, steady diet that asked for patience and offered survival. No one ate medieval food for joy. They ate it because tomorrow depended on today's strength. The pot simmered, the fire burned low, and people learned to live on very little for a very long time. When people imagine the past, they imagine meat, roasted meat, big cuts, hunters carrying animals over their shoulders, medieval feasts with whole pigs turning over fires. It feels natural to assume people ate more meat before modern rules, modern fears, modern diets. The truth is almost the opposite. For most of history, meat was unusual, and when it appeared, it came with risk. Animals were not raised to be eaten quickly. They were investments. A cow pulled plows, a goat gave milk, a chicken laid eggs. Killing an animal meant losing future food for immediate calories. That decision wasn't taken lightly, so meat stayed alive as long as possible. When animals were slaughtered, it was often because they were old, injured, or no longer useful. This meant the meat was tougher, harder to digest, sometimes already unhealthy. Fresh, young meat was a luxury. And even when you had meat, the clock started ticking immediately. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled fast, especially in warm climates, especially in summer. People knew this. They didn't know about bacteria, but they understood rot. They understood smell. They understood that meat could turn from food to danger very quickly, so they preserved it. Salting was common, but salt was expensive. You couldn't always use enough. Smoking helped, but only if done properly. Drying worked in certain climates, but not all. And even preserved meat could go bad if stored poorly. People ate questionable meat often. Cooking helped, but it wasn't a guarantee. Parasites survived heat. Some illnesses didn't show up right away. You might feel fine for days before getting sick. Nobody connected cause and effect the way we do now, so meat carried a reputation. It was strength, yes, but also illness. Worms were common. Trichinosis from pork, tapeworms from beef and fish. People didn't know what caused them, only that eating certain foods sometimes led to long, uncomfortable problems. Still, meat was tempting. Fat meant energy. Protein meant strength. When people had the chance, they took it. But chances were limited. Most ordinary people ate meat only during festivals, holidays, or special occasions. Religious calendars mattered here. Christianity, Judaism, Islam regulated meat consumption. Fasting days limited it. Certain animals were forbidden. Certain times of year demanded abstinence. These rules weren't just spiritual, they were practical. Fasting reduced demand during scarce periods. It spread consumption out. It turned necessity into virtue. If you couldn't eat meat, it wasn't because you were poor. It was because you were holy. This softened the blow of scarcity. But fasting didn't mean not eating. It meant eating differently. Fish replaced meat. Eggs sometimes replaced meat. Dairy filled gaps when allowed. And on bad days, people bent the rules. Church records are full of debates about what counted as meat. Was beaver fish or meat? What about birds that lived near water? People argued because food mattered. Fish deserves special attention here. Fish was more common than meat in many places, especially near rivers or coasts. But fish spoiled even faster than meat. Markets smelled strongly of it, strongly enough that writers complained. Repeatedly, salted fish became a staple. Herring, cod, cheap, preserved, transportable, but heavily salted fish wasn't pleasant. It was tough, dry, and thirsty work to eat. You soaked it, you boiled it, you masked it with herbs if you could. Still, it filled bowls. The elite lived differently, of course. They ate meat more often. They hunted for sport. They consumed fresh kills. They hosted feasts built around meat. But even elite diets weren't safe. Large meals meant heavy digestion. Too much meat led to gout, a disease so common among nobles, it became associated with status. Painful joints, swollen feet, a visible sign that you ate well and paid for it. Elite banquets sometimes pushed the body too far. People got sick from overeating, from spoiled food, from alcohol. Vomiting was not unusual, neither was diarrhea. These were accepted risks of indulgence. The poor watched this with mixed feelings. On one hand, meat represented success. On the other, they saw the consequences. They knew meat wasn't magic. It could harm as much as help. This created a strange balance. Meat was desired, but not trusted. Celebrated, but feared. Even cooking methods show this tension. Meat was often boiled, not roasted. Boiling reduced risk. It made tough meat edible. It allowed fats to be skimmed and reused. Roasting looked impressive, but boiling was safer. Stews again. Always stews. Bones went into pots. Fat was saved. Scraps mattered. Nothing was wasted because meat was too rare to waste. And when meat was absent, people survived without it. Slowly, thinly, but they survived. Modern people often ask, how did they get protein? The answer is, less than we think. Beans, lentils, peas, dairy when possible, fish, eggs, and small amounts of meat, spread thin. Strength didn't come from abundance, it came from adaptation. Still, disease followed meat consumption closely. Outbreaks of illness often tracked animal slaughter. People noticed patterns without understanding them. They feared certain foods at certain times. Some meats became associated with sickness. Taboos formed. Not all taboos were religious. Some were learned, and yet hunger often overruled caution. If meat was available, people ate it. Risk was better than starvation. This is something modern food safety has erased from memory. We assume food should never hurt us. For most of history, food hurting you was normal. It was a calculated risk. You ate and hoped. Meat didn't make people stronger across the board. It created moments of strength, temporary fullness, brief energy, followed by long gaps. That's why meat became symbolic. It meant celebration. It meant abundance. It meant victory over scarcity, even if only for a day. And symbols matter when reality is hard. So when you imagine the past as a place of constant roasted meat, remember this instead. A pot with a bone in it. One bone, boiled until nothing remains. Shared among many, a hint of fat floating on top. That was meat for most people. Rare, risky, powerful, and never as simple as we wish it had been. Bread kept people alive. It also sometimes made them lose their minds. This is not a metaphor. For most of history, bread was the safest food people had. It was familiar, it was filling, it was reliable in a world that wasn't. When people were unsure what to eat, they reached for bread. That trust made it dangerous. Grain was grown outdoors, stored in damp buildings, and ground months later. It was exposed to rain, heat, insects, rodents, and mold. None of this was hidden. People saw it. They smelled it. They ate it anyway. because the alternative was hunger. One of the most dangerous threats hiding in bread was ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains, especially in cool, wet climates. It looks like dark, twisted grains mixed in with normal ones. Easy to miss, easy to grind into flour. When eaten, ergot does strange things to the human body. Sometimes it caused intense burning sensations in the limbs. People called it St. Anthony's fire. Hands and feet felt like they were on fire. Flesh could die. Fingers and toes could fall off. Other times, it attacked the mind. Hallucinations, convulsions, confusion. People saw visions, heard voices, laughed uncontrollably, or screamed, or danced until they collapsed. Entire villages could be affected at once, because everyone ate the same bread. No one knew why. From the outside, it looked like possession, or punishment, or madness spreading through the air. People prayed, they fasted, they blamed demons, they blamed witches, they blamed each other. The bread kept being eaten. Ergot poisoning didn't happen everywhere, but when it did, it left deep marks on history. Some historians believe outbreaks influenced religious visions, mass hysteria, and even witch trials. Whether or not every case connects, the pattern is clear. Bad bread changed behavior, and ergot wasn't the only threat. Moldy grain was common. Sometimes it just tasted bad. Sometimes it caused vomiting and diarrhea. Sometimes it caused slow poisoning. People didn't separate food illness from other illness. You got sick. That was life. Grain could also be contaminated by animal waste. Rodents lived in storage areas. Birds nested in barns. Droppings ended up in flour. Again, people noticed. Again, they ate it. Flour was precious. You didn't throw it away unless it was completely unusable. Bread could also include things that were never meant to be there. We've already talked about dirt and fillers during famine, but even in normal times, grain might be mixed with weeds. Seeds from plants that looked harmless but weren't. Some caused numbness, some caused stomach pain, some caused long-term damage. The line between food and poison was thin and blurry, and no one labeled anything. There were no ingredients lists, no warnings, no recall notices. You learned from experience, or you didn't survive long enough to learn. Baking did not make bread safe. Heat helped with some things, but not all. Toxins survived. Spores survived. People assumed baking purified food because it felt like it should. When it didn't work, blame went elsewhere. This created a quiet fear around bread that never fully surfaced. People depended on it too much to openly distrust it. Instead, fear became ritual. Bread was blessed. Bread was prayed over. Bread was treated with respect. Dropping bread was unlucky. Wasting bread was sinful. These weren't just symbolic gestures. They were attempts to make something dangerous feel safe. If you treat bread as sacred, maybe it won't hurt you. There's something deeply human about that logic. People also noticed patterns. Bread from certain fields caused sickness. Bread eaten at certain times of year caused problems. They adjusted without understanding why. Avoided certain harvests when possible. Mixed grain from different sources to spread risk. Risk management without science. Children were often affected most. Smaller bodies, less tolerance. When whole families ate the same bread, the weakest suffered first. Adults noticed. They worried. But bread was still bread. You couldn't just stop eating it. So people lived with quiet dread. There are records of monasteries and hospitals caring for victims of food-related illness, especially during bad harvest years. They describe symptoms we now recognize as poisoning, but at the time, they were mysteries. Religious explanations filled the gap. If food made you sick, maybe God was angry. Maybe you were being tested. Maybe it was meant to happen. This belief helped people cope, but it didn't fix anything. Even when bread didn't actively poison people, it often wasn't nutritious enough. Refining grain removed nutrients. Poor diets led to deficiencies. Pellagra, caused by lack of niacin, appeared later with maize-heavy diets. It caused skin problems, diarrhea, dementia. Again, people didn't know why. They blamed weather, fate, God, anything but food, because food was too central to question. There's a kind of dark humor in this. If you look closely, people joked about bad bread, complained about loaves that made you feel strange, warned neighbors quietly, laughed nervously. Humor softened fear, and fear was constant. Modern people trust bread completely. It's one of the safest foods we have. That trust is new, very new. For most of history, bread was a gamble you took every day, not because people were careless, because they were trapped. Bread was cheap, Bread was filling. Bread was the difference between hunger and survival, so people kept eating it, even when it hurt them. This is one of the hardest things to accept about the past. People didn't just face hunger. They faced uncertainty inside the very thing meant to protect them from hunger. Food was not neutral. It was risky. It could betray you slowly, quietly, without warning. And yet, bread remained central. Civilizations rose and fell on grain. Wars were fought over it. Gods were thanked for it. Why? Because despite everything, it worked more often than it failed. Most days, bread didn't kill you. Most days, it just filled your stomach enough to keep going. And when you live close to the edge, most days is good enough. Bread that could kill you still felt better than no bread at all. So people ate, they prayed, they hoped. And they lived in a world where the most ordinary food carried a shadow one they learned to live with. Because there was no other choice. Tomorrow's meal would look the same as today's. And tomorrow, just like today, they would trust it anyway. Spices have always been shiny things. Bright red, deep black, golden yellow, tiny miracles packed in little jars. Small enough to fit in your hand, but expensive enough to fill a purse. Today, we sprinkle them freely on food without thinking. In the past, they were practically treasure. And not just because they tasted good. Spices were about survival, about power, about showing that you could. Take pepper, for instance. In medieval Europe, it was worth more than gold by weight. That's not exaggeration. Black pepper traveled thousands of miles over land and sea. Caravans moved it through deserts and mountains. Ships risked storms and pirates. Every kernel had risk baked into it. Why? Pepper wasn't just for flavor. It masked the taste of meat that was starting to go off. A little sprinkle could make something borderline edible seem acceptable. Salt did the same, but was more common. Pepper was expensive, exotic, and therefore impressive. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, the same story. They hid spoilage, added novelty, and signaled wealth. If you ate them, people knew you had money, you had connections, you had reached beyond your village. And for the poor, spices were almost never seen. Ordinary cooks couldn't afford them. They relied on local herbs, parsley, thyme, sage, dill, not glamorous, but functional. Cheap flavor, cheap comfort. Spices were also medicine. People believed that flavors weren't just tastes, they were properties. Hot spices warmed the body. Bitter spices cleansed it. Sweet spices brought joy. They were prescribed, they were rationed, they were hoarded, and they were political. Kings, merchants, and traders controlled who got spices. Access meant influence. If you could supply cinnamon to a royal court, you weren't just a merchant, you were essential. Wars were fought over trade routes. Treaties negotiated. Spices mattered more than armies in some ways, so food became a display, a tool, a measure of who belonged where in society. You could eat, or you could show that you could eat in style. But there's an irony here. Most spice-heavy dishes didn't taste like they do now. Recipes called 4 pounds of one spice, but without balancing ingredients. Meals could be overwhelming, even nauseating. The point wasn't delicacy, was abundance, protection, and prestige. Spices created a strange world where survival and luxury overlapped. You could eat bad meat, but taste good with the right seasoning. You could show status by eating the same food as everyone else, but with a pinch of something rare. Hunger was the baseline, flavor was the exception, and humor survived even here. Writers joked about overly spiced dishes, complained about foreign recipes, poked fun at the wealthy trying too hard. People laughed at extravagance, quietly, because it didn't fix hunger but it made time pass. The lesson is simple. Spices were never just about taste, they were about life, and sometimes about surviving life with dignity. They were markers of safety, signals of wealth, and the only way to make some foods remotely enjoyable. And when you understand that, even a little pinch of pepper carries a long history, trade, danger, hope, and the constant shadow of hunger just beneath the flavor. When we think of ancient diets in Asia, we often imagine rice, fish, and delicate flavors. And yes, rice was everywhere. But behind the calm, balanced images lies a story of survival, patience, and relentless adaptation, one that is often quieter than the banquet halls of Europe or the Nile's bread-filled streets. Rice is a remarkable crop. It grows densely, produces many calories per square foot, and stores relatively well if kept dry. In Asia, rice became the backbone of life, shaping society, labor, and even government. In China, for example, the state measured harvests carefully. Granaries weren't just storage, they were insurance policies. If a flood destroyed fields, rice could be rationed, moved, and distributed to prevent famine. That control over food literally kept populations alive. But rice alone could not sustain health. It's filling, yes, but not very diverse in nutrients. People paired it with beans, soy products, vegetables, and small amounts of meat or fish. For centuries, fermentation became a cornerstone of Asian diets. Soy sauce, miso, fermented fish, pickled vegetables, these weren't luxury items. They were preservation tools. Fermentation allowed food to last longer, reduced the risk of illness, and added flavor to an otherwise monotonous diet. Fermentation was clever. It turned scarcity into opportunity. A batch of soybeans, boiled and salted, could last months or even years. Rice could be stored as dried cakes or transformed into rice wine. Fish and vegetables could be pickled and eaten out of season. This meant that even in harsh winters or poor harvests, people could still eat something edible, even nourishing. Still, famine was never far away. Historical records tell of repeated crop failures, floods, and droughts that caused mass starvation in China, Japan, and India. People relied on whatever grains were available: millet, barley, buckwheats, sometimes mixing them into rice to stretch meals. In India, legumes and ghee added calories and flavor, but again, only when available. Diet was a negotiation with nature. The flavor profiles in ancient Asia tell the same story as diets elsewhere. What we now think of as refined or exotic often emerged from necessity. Soy sauce originally masked the taste of slightly spoiled fish. Pickled vegetables preserved nutrition that would otherwise vanish. Spices were rarer than today, used both to improve taste and to keep food edible longer. People didn't eat for pleasure as much as they ate to endure. Fish, like meat in Europe, was powerful but risky. Freshwater fish could spoil in hours. Salted fish traveled well, but was strong, pungent, and required skill to prepare safely. Urban markets buzzed with life and smell. Streets were crowded, heat was constant, and bacteria thrived. People tolerated odors they would find unbearable today because survival required it. Food was also deeply social. Families shared meals. Communities relied on collective knowledge of preservation, preparation, and seasonality. Festivals offered rare indulgences, meats, sweets, richer rice dishes. These weren't just treats. They marked social cohesion, seasonal rhythm, and religious observance. But the rest of the year demanded restraint. Labor shaped what people could eat. Farmers spent dawn to dusk in fields. Laborers worked city streets or canals. Food had to fuel the body without wasting time or energy. Quick filling meals were preferable. Slow meals were rare. Bread, rice, or pottage-like dishes were common dishes that could be prepared in bulk, eaten quickly, and stretched for later. Yet despite clever techniques, hunger was a constant whisper. A poor harvest could erase months of careful preparation. Families had fallback foods, dried leaves, root vegetables, weeds. Children went hungry first. Elders suffered quietly. Adults learned to ration with grim efficiency. Hunger was normalized, tempered by ingenuity and patience. Humor persisted. Jokes about salty fish, fermented bean smells, or tough rice cakes appear in historical anecdotes. Writers complained about monotonous meals. Songs referenced hunger and hard labor. Humor softened life, but didn't eliminate risk. Religion and philosophy often framed scarcity and endurance. Confucian and Buddhist texts advised moderation, patience, and mindfulness in consumption. Fasting and small portions were praised as virtue. Discipline was survival. Understanding the seasons, the harvest, and the proper storage of rice or beans was considered wisdom. Knowledge equaled security. For elite classes, the story was slightly different. Rice was enriched with rare foods, meats, spices, dried fruits. Feasts displayed wealth, power, and access. But even elites faced limits. Without modern preservation, fresh ingredients spoiled quickly. They relied on cooks, storage, and skill. Excess came with risk. Foodborne illness, spoiled meals, and digestive upset. One remarkable feature of Asian diets was balance between necessity and subtle enjoyment. While the poor focused on calories and survival, the techniques of fermentation, pickling, and flavoring meant that even the humblest meal had depth. Unlike in Europe, where repetitive grains dominated, Asian diets often introduced acidity, saltiness, and umami, small victories over monotony. This required knowledge. Recipes were oral or handwritten. Knowledge of timing, preparation, and storage was survival information. Too much salt, the food was ruined. Too little, spoilage returned. Overcooked, nutrients lost. Every meal was a negotiation between chemistry, patience, and intuition. Famine, war, and disease constantly tested these systems. When disaster struck, communities relied on stored grains, legumes, and preserved foods. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Starvation remained a possibility. Death came quietly for the vulnerable. Hunger never went away, only changed form. The lesson from Asia mirrors the lesson from Europe and Africa. Food shaped life, society, and thought. It determined labor, religion, humor, and hierarchy. It taught patience. It taught innovation. It reminded people daily that survival required planning, skill, and endurance. In essence, the rice paddies, the fermented jars, and the markets of ancient Asia tell the same story as bread ovens and pottage pots elsewhere. Food was never simple. It was a system, a puzzle, and a gamble. People ate what they could, preserved what they could, and hoped it would be enough to see tomorrow. And when it wasn't, they learned to endure, slowly, carefully, resiliently. Hunger was always there, in the background, like a quiet drumbeat. Civilization didn't eliminate it. It merely taught people how to live alongside it, finding tiny ways to make life bearable and, sometimes even flavorful in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Rice, fermentation, patience, and endurance. These were the pillars of ancient Asian diets. They weren't luxurious. They weren't indulgent. They were survival, and in a subtle, quiet way, they worked remarkably well. People endured, lived, laughed, and adapted sometimes. They aliened the strength of careful preparation and modest ingenuity. And that is a story worth telling, because it reminds us that abundance, safety, and flavor are very modern luxuries. Even a simple rice cake carried centuries of labor, knowledge, and the faint echo of hunger survived, remembered, and respected. Before European ships appeared on distant shores, indigenous peoples around the world had already developed incredibly sophisticated food systems. These weren't primitive or simple. They were tuned to the land, the seasons, and the needs of the community. People ate what nature offered, preserved it when necessary, and rotated crops or hunted sustainably to keep the system balanced. Yet, for all their efficiency, these diets could also be harsh, unpredictable, and shaped by scarcity. Take North America. Long before corn, beans, and squash became household words, they formed the backbone of survival. Corn maize was not sweet like modern corn. It was dense, starchy, and had to be treated carefully, often with lime water, to release nutrients. Beans added protein, complementing the corn. Squash provided calories and vitamins. This trio, called the Three Sisters, was ingenious. Each plant helped the others grow, improved soil quality, and offered seasonal stability. Hunting complemented farming. Deer, rabbits, fish, shellfish, they provided protein, fat, and sometimes clothing, but success was never guaranteed. Hunters often returned empty-handed. Animals migrated. Rivers ran low. Weather interfered. When meat was scarce, people relied on plants, nuts, berries, or even insects. Survival demanded flexibility. It demanded respect for the land. Indigenous diets weren't uniform. In the Arctic, people relied on seals, whales, and fish, supplemented by whatever berries or roots were available. In the Amazon, manioc, fish, and wild game predominated. In Australia, bush foods like yams, seeds, and small marsupials were staples. Every region shaped what was edible, when, and how it was preserved. Preservation was crucial. Smoking, drying, fermenting, or burying foods allowed communities to survive lean seasons. People learned not only which foods were edible, but how to store them safely. Spoiled food could be fatal, so knowledge was survival. This wasn't cuisine, it was life insurance. Yet even with smart systems, scarcity was constant. Poor harvests, droughts, floods, or overhunting could bring famine. People developed fallback foods, acorns, bark, roots, or insects. Some were nutritious, some were last resort fillers. Sometimes famine hit suddenly, wiping out communities before they could adapt. And then came colonization. European arrivals disrupted these intricate systems almost overnight. Lands were taken, crops destroyed, hunting grounds overrun. Diseases decimated populations, further destabilizing food security. What had been a balanced diet, adapted over centuries, was replaced with scarcity imposed externally. Indigenous peoples faced starvation not because of poor farming, but because their entire system was disrupted. Yet the ingenuity remained. Communities adapted. They preserved, traded, and rotated diets to survive as best they could. Seeds were hidden. Recipes changed. People remembered how to live in a world where food could disappear, where abundance was fragile, and where survival required constant attention. Indigenous diets, before colonization, remind us that food is never just about taste. It's about knowledge, skill, and adaptation. It's about paying attention to the environment, respecting seasons, and understanding the limits of your body. Hunger wasn't a distant threat, it was a part of life, quietly guiding choices every day. This chapter highlights something often forgotten. Many pre-modern diets were healthier and more sustainable than the ones that replaced them. Communities had variety over the year, balanced nutrition, and systems designed to preserve both land and life. But they also understood scarcity, unpredictability, and the need for endurance. Food was survival first, culture second, and humor existed here too. Stories about bad harvests, missed hunts, or the stubbornness of certain crops appear in oral traditions. Jokes, songs, and playful warnings helped people endure hardships, creating social cohesion while recognizing life's constant uncertainties. Hunger was normalized, but not romanticized. Meals were eaten with gratitude, with strategy, and often with shared laughter at the absurdities of survival. The lessons are simple. Food is precious, unpredictability is natural, and adaptation is necessary. Indigenous diets before colonization teach us that humans are resourceful. They can thrive on a system closely attuned to nature, even when it's harsh, even when it demands patience, endurance, and occasional improvisation. And they remind us that abundance is fragile and often contingent on systems that must be respected, something modern life has largely forgotten. In short, survival depended on knowing what to eat, when to eat it, and how to preserve it. It demanded observation, flexibility, and respect. And, like every chapter of human history, it was punctuated by hunger, humor, and hope. Hunger is more than an inconvenience. It has always been a tool. For thousands of years, rulers, armies, and governments have used food to control people. Starve a city, and you don't just weaken bodies, you weaken morale, loyalty, and resistance. Hunger becomes a lever, silent but devastating, shaping history as much as swords or laws. Sieges are the clearest example. Medieval castles and walled cities were built with defense in mind. But no wall can stop famine if the attackers control the outside. Invading armies cut off food supplies, burned fields, and blocked roads. Those inside could eat only what they had stored. Bread ran out, grain stores emptied, pottage pots grew thinner. Children cried, adults rationed. Desperation escalated. Cities fell more often to empty stomachs than to arrows or catapults. The same principle applied on a larger scale. In early modern Europe, rulers sometimes withheld grain to manipulate prices or assert authority. Farmers might be forced to sell crops at low rates, while cities suffered. Starvation became an economic weapon. People complied or they died. It was that simple. Colonial powers used hunger deliberately. Indigenous populations, especially in the Americas, were deprived of traditional foods, their crops destroyed or confiscated. European imports replaced them, often inadequately. Starvation was predictable. It broke resistance, reshaped societies, and cemented control. Hunger was not a side effect, it was a policy. Even governments within Europe weaponized scarcity. Hoarding grain, limiting trade, or prioritizing elites meant that the poor suffered predictably. Bad harvests became crises, not only because of nature, but because the system funneled resources unevenly. Starvation highlighted inequality starkly. Survival depended on your social position as much as your skills. Hunger was not always visible. It lurked quietly. You didn't need to see famine to feel it. People rationed silently, skipped meals, substituted bark or roots for bread. Children went without breakfast. Elders went hungry to feed younger family members. Starvation shaped daily life long before it became headline news. The psychological effect was profound. Hunger breeds fear, anxiety, and desperation. Communities adapt, yes, but always with a shadow looming. People steal, fight, migrate, or beg. Social bonds strain under the pressure of insufficient food. Entire populations can become pliable, obedient, or broken under prolonged deprivation. Yet people resisted creatively. They found hidden food sources, wild plants, scavenged roots, preserved fish, or seeds kept for emergencies. Famine diets emerged, sometimes grim but ingenious. Knowledge passed down about what could be eaten, what would survive storage, and what could be cooked safely. Survival required improvisation. Hunger as a weapon left long memories. Even after scarcity ended, people hoarded, rationed, and preserved. Cultural habits of saving seeds, drying grains, fermenting vegetables, or celebrating bountiful harvests reflect this history. Humans remember hunger even when they have abundance. There's a dark humor in these situations too. Songs and stories joke about empty pots, thin gruel, or clever ways to steal food from granaries. Humor didn't reduce suffering, but it allowed people to endure. It's a quiet defiance in the face of control. Hunger reminds us that food is never neutral. It's survival, it's leverage, it's power. Governments, armies, and elites understood this instinctively long before nutritionists or economists could explain it. When food disappears, control shifts. The body bends, the mind bends, society bends. Even today, history echoes in cultural memory. Holidays, fasting rituals, harvest festivals, and seed-saving traditions all carry traces of the fear of scarcity. Food remains central not just to life, but to social structure and political stability. In the past, hunger was never just personal. It was structural, it was political, and it was deliberate, often designed to make people comply, submit, or surrender. For most of human history, those who controlled food controlled everything else. And yet, people adapted, endured, shared what little they had, found humor in hardship, remembered, and sometimes, just sometimes, they survived. Hunger, as a weapon, is a reminder that food is more than taste or pleasure. It's memory, control, resilience, and sometimes quiet rebellion. It shapes societies, molds human behavior, and leaves marks that last for generations. Even in abundance today, echoes of these lessons remain. Food is never just food. It is life, it is power, and history remembers both.
Imagine opening your cupboard door, your medieval pantry, and seeing the same food every single day. Not a different flavor, not a new spice, not even a change in texture. Just the same grains, the same pottage, the same dull filling bread. Day after day, year after year. This was normal for most of history. And it was exhausting. We modern people like to think of variety as a right. Oh, I want sushi tonight, maybe pasta tomorrow, ice cream on Sunday. For most of history, variety wasn't a luxury. It was an impossibility. The seasons dictated what you could eat. Spoilage dictated what you would eat. And if something ran out, you ate something else maybe less desirable, maybe almost inedible, but rarely anything new, rare or exciting. Bread, porridge, and pottage formed the foundation of countless diets. Each meal was functional. Each meal was filling. Each meal reminded you that survival mattered more than enjoyment. A pot simmered on the fire. Flour and water turned into dough. Beans boiled until soft. Leaves, roots, and occasional scraps of meat added minimal flavor. That was dinner. That was lunch. That was life. Monotony shaped the human mind as much as the human body. When every meal is the same, your expectations adjust. Your taste buds dull. You stop noticing flavor. Food becomes an instrument of survival, not pleasure. This wasn't just physical, it was psychological. People learned patience, discipline, and acceptance, but also frustration and fatigue. They longed for what they could rarely have, dreaming of something rare, fresh fruit in winter, meat in summer, spices in everyday meals. Rare treats were not indulgences, they were lifelines. Historical records make this vivid. Monks, peasants, sailors, and soldiers alike wrote about the tiresome sameness of their diets. "We eat little else but boiled grain," one monk complained in the 12th century. Sailors on long voyages sustained themselves on ships' biscuit-hard, tasteless crackers that could last months. The language used to describe these foods is dry, flat, sometimes humorous. "Tastes like sawdust," they'd joke, but humor was a small shield against despair. It didn't change the monotony, it softened it. Monotony had nutritional consequences too. People weren't getting balanced diets, one grain over another, one tuber instead of leafy greens, one fish instead of varied protein. Deficiencies were common. Scurvy, beriberi, rickets, anemial illnesses caused by dietary gaps scrapped silently through populations. They didn't happen all at once. They were slow, cumulative. Symptoms appeared gradually, bodies weakened, minds dulled. People adapted, but adaptation has limits. The monotony of meals also reinforced social hierarchies. Elites could access variety, while the majority endured sameness. A noble might eat meat multiple times a week, enjoy imported fruits, or add spices that masked stale flavors. Meanwhile, peasants got what was available locally, seasonally, and cheaply. The monotony of the poor's diet was both physical necessity and social statement. This is your place, this is your food. Yet humans are resilient. People invented little tricks to cope with monotony. Herbs, when available, became precious. A pinch of wild garlic or parsley could transform a dull portage into something tolerable. Preservation techniques, pickling, drying, fermenting offered faint novelty throughout the year. Even the act of gathering food could break monotony. A rare berry, a small rabbit, or a freshly caught fish felt like victory. Little victories counted, and humor persisted. Writings from medieval Europe and Asia describe the absurdity of repetitive meals. "We have eaten barley for 100 days, and it still tastes like barley," one chronicler noted dryly. Sailors and soldiers sang songs about the sameness of shipboard food. Jokes were a small rebellion against monotony. They didn't create variety, but they gave people a sense of control over it. Monotony also shaped imagination. People dreamed of flavors they had never tasted or had tasted only once in childhood. Exotic spices, rare fruits, distant landseas dreams were mental escapes from the relentless sameness of daily meals. They fueled exploration, trade, and migration. Sometimes the memory of flavor motivated entire journeys. Hunger wasn't just physical, it became desire, creativity, and curiosity. There's a psychological cost we often underestimate. Repetition wears on the mind. Modern food is designed to entertain the senses: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, umami, constantly shifting textures, temperatures, and colors. Historical diets offered little stimulation. People ate for the body first, the mind second. And when the mind craved stimulation, it had to invent small pleasures. A slightly toasted loaf, a rare spring vegetable, the excitement of a new grain in the pot. Monotony also reinforced patience. People learned to tolerate discomfort, to manage expectations, to endure waiting. Hunger and sameness were teachers. They taught caution, planning, and respect for what little the land offered, and sometimes they taught gratitude, a slightly better harvest, a pot with a hint of meat, a handful of berries. Moments that would have been ordinary for us were luxuries for them. But monotony was not just endurance, it was survival strategy. By keeping diets simple, people reduced spoilage, minimized risk, and stretched resources. Predictable meals allowed for predictable storage, rationing, and planning. It wasn't gourmet, it was efficient. Efficiency often meant the difference between life and death. Still, monotony could become deadly. In some regions, over-reliance on a single crop led to disasters. Ireland's potato famine, dependent on one tuber, shows how repetition and lack of variety can amplify vulnerability. Monotony makes diets fragile. One bad harvest, one crop failure, and hunger escalates quickly. Even with scarcity, humans found subtle ways to inject novelty. Seasonings, rare vegetables, herbs, fermented foods, these small touches mattered. Communities celebrated feasts, festivals, and occasional indulgences, breaking the pattern temporarily. These moments became stories, songs, memories, and aspirations. They reminded people that monotony could be disrupted, even briefly, and that pleasure, though rare, was still possible. Monotony also shaped social life. Sharing the same food with neighbors, family, and community reinforced bonds. Eating together, enduring the same limitations, created shared understanding. The predictability of food offered a strange kind of comfort. You knew what tomorrow would bring, and you learned to manage it. In the end, eating the same thing forever was not just about scarcity, it was about endurance, patience, and human adaptability. People survived not because meals were exciting, but because they were persistent. They learned to stretch resources, tolerate repetition, and find small joys where possible. So when you complain about eating the same lunch 3 days in a row, remember, for most of human history, the same meal for a week, a month, or even a season was normal, and people survived, laughed, endured, and sometimes even thrived despite it. Monotony was harsh, but it was also a teacher, showing humans the value of patience, resilience, and small pleasures in a world where food was never guaranteed. Tomorrow's meal would likely be the same, and the day after that, and the day after that. And yet, people ate and endured and lived.
Imagine walking through a market in the summer, centuries ago, long before electricity or modern refrigeration. The sun beats down, stalls are crowded, people call out, haggling over prices, and then the smell hits you. It's strong, sharp, confusing, a mix of fish, meat, grain, vegetables, and yes, rot. Heat, humidity, and the lack of cooling turn food into an aromatic assault. And yet, life goes on. People breathe it in, negotiate over it, pick what they need, and move on. To survive, you learn to tolerate smells that would make most modern noses recoil. Before refrigeration, spoilage was constant. Meat went bad fast. Fish was even worse. Milk soured in hours, cream separated, eggs warmed, and risked contamination. Even vegetables wilted or fermented in the heat. The line between edible and dangerous was thin, moving, and sometimes invisible. People had to rely on judgment, experience, and sometimes guesswork. Cooking wasn't just about flavor, it was about survival. Heat killed some bacteria, masked some odors, and made tougher foods edible. Boiling, roasting, and smoking were standard practices, each with its own limitations. A slow-cooked stew might hide a little age in the meat. Frying a fish could make it tolerable even if it had started to spoil. Cooking wasn't comfort, it was strategy. Insects and vermin were also constant companions. Flies hovered over open food. Rats sneaked into granaries. Food storage was precarious. You had to protect what you could, clean what you could, and eat quickly what you couldn't. Sometimes, contamination was unavoidable. People adapted. They accepted a small risk because the alternative, going hungry, was worse. Markets themselves were sensory education. Buyers learned to judge freshness by touch, sight, and smell. Fish eyes, meat texture, bread, weight. A slight sourness in milk might signal spoilage, or just that it was at the edge of edibility. Experience mattered. Children learned young. One sniff could determine survival. One wrong choice could make you sick or worse. The smell of food before refrigeration wasn't just unpleasant. It was a marker of time. It told you how long something had been out. It warned of what was safe to eat and what wasn't. People developed noses attuned to decay. What we consider foul, they considered informative, and sometimes humorous. Writers, travelers, and chroniclers commented on markets with a mix of disgust and amusement. The fish stalls could knock a grown man over, one noted dryly. Humor softened the horror. Preservation methods helped, but only partially. Salted fish, smoked meats, pickled vegetables all extended shelf life. Ice could be stored in cold pits or harvested in winter, but it was scarce and precious. Canning didn't exist yet, and pasteurization was centuries away. People relied on what the land and the seasons provided. Even with skill, spoilage was inevitable. Communities developed strategies. Daily shopping, shared storage, rationing, and careful planning allowed people to avoid the worst. Households learned to prioritize meals based on perishability. Meat for today, bread for tomorrow, vegetables for whenever possible. Timing was everything. Cooking was continuous. Leftovers were reheated, boiled, or repurposed in new pottages. Nothing went to waste unless unavoidable. The smell of food also shaped behavior. People avoided certain foods in summer, waited for winter to eat certain meats, or celebrated harvests with excess because preservation was temporarily easier. Smell dictated mood, timing, and social patterns. Markets thrived when people could handle the odors, and communities survived because everyone learned how to manage them. Hunger influenced perception, too. A starving person might eat a slightly spoiled loaf or a soft fish without complaint. Desperation altered the relationship with smell and taste. What was intolerable when full could be tolerable, or even desirable when empty. Survival rewired expectations. Even children participated. They learned the smells that indicated freshness or rot. They were taught to respect heat, timing, and preparation. These lessons weren't optional, they were essential for life. A misjudged smell could mean illness, and illness could be fatal, especially in crowded cities or during famine. Religion, superstition, and custom also shaped interaction with food. Smells. Certain foods were associated with seasons, festivals, or rituals. Some smells signaled celebration, others hinted at scarcity. People interpreted odors as omens, guidance, or warnings. Cooking, baking, and fermenting became rituals layered with meaning beyond sustenance. Yet despite the intensity, people endured and sometimes found small pleasures. Freshly baked bread still smelled heavenly. Smoked fish had flavor. Pickles could excite the senses. Even amidst decay, there were moments of delight. Humor again appeared in writings and anecdotes. Complaints about the stench, jokes about rats, exaggerated tales of market horror. Humor was a buffer. It made life bearable. The smell of food before refrigeration was not a flaw of the past. It was reality. It was the backdrop to daily life, teaching patience, judgment, and resilience. People ate, worked, celebrated, and survived, surrounded by scents we would find intolerable. They adapted, found joy where they could, and continued living. In a way, these smells were memory. They marked the rhythm of life, harvests, seasons, feasts, scarcity. They connected people to their environment, forcing attention to what they ate and how they preserved it. Modern abundance has erased this memory. Refrigeration, packaging, and year-round supply have made spoilage invisible. We forget the constant vigilance that earlier generations practiced daily. The lesson is simple. Food was alive before refrigeration. It breathed, fermented, rotted, and smelled. It demanded attention, respect, and strategy. Survival depended on it. And yet, humans managed. They endured. They laughed. They adapted. They lived. Smell, like hunger, was a teacher. It reminded people that life was uncertain. Food was precious, and survival required constant care. And in that uncertainty, humans grew resourceful, resilient, and, sometimes, quietly amused by the absurdity of it all. So next time you open your fridge, think about the smell or the lack of it. For centuries, life smelled sharp, sour, smoky, and alive, and people ate, survived, and thrived, one potent aroma at a time. Imagine a world where the bread you ate could kill you, the meat might make you sick, the fish smelled like a small harbor, and every bite required judgment, patience, and luck. That world persisted for centuries, and then, slowly, things started to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, imperceptibly. Humanity began to create safer, more reliable food. The earliest innovations weren't flashy. They weren't packaged, refrigerated, or marketed. They were small victories against spoilage and uncertainty. Canning, for instance, was invented in the early 19th century. A French chef-turned-inventor named Nicolas Appert discovered that heating food in sealed glass jars could preserve it for months. Soldiers in Napoleon's army ate it. Sailors at sea survived on it. For the first time, people could rely on food that didn't immediately threaten their stomachs. Ice houses and ice harvesting arrived even earlier in some places. Wealthy households in Europe and North America built underground storage rooms filled with ice, harvested in winter. Perishable foods, meats, dairy, fruits could last longer than ever before. For ordinary people, this was a privilege, but it marked the beginning of a cultural shift. The idea that food could be safe outside of immediate consumption. Boiling, smoking, fermenting, and salting continued, but science began to creep in. Pasteurization, discovered by Louis Pasteur in the 19th century, explained why milk and beer could spoil not depending on heat treatment. Suddenly, spoilage wasn't mysterious or terrifying. It could be managed. People no longer had to pray that bread wouldn't carry fungus or that milk wouldn't kill. Knowledge replaced guesswork. Industrialization changed everything. Grain mills could process wheat more efficiently. Shipping and railways allowed food to travel longer distances without decaying. Markets became more predictable. Storage improved. For the first time in history, food could be moved from place to place with confidence. Urban populations grew, relying on industrial systems rather than local farms alone. But the transition was slow. Even in the early 19th century, most people couldn't rely on safe food year-round. Spoilage was still common. Meat and fish were risky. Markets still reeked in summer heat. Ice was limited. Preservation was expensive. Knowledge mattered as much as wealth. Food safety wasn't a guarantee, it was a hope, an improvement, a step forward. People learned to adapt gradually. Recipes shifted to accommodate longer preservation. Cooking methods changed. Canning, freezing, and pasteurization allowed foods to last weeks, not hours. Knowledge about hygiene spread. Urban regulations began to enforce cleanliness in markets and slaughterhouses. Slowly, the shadow of death that hovered over every meal receded, and yet, even with progress, habits persisted. People remembered hunger, they remembered spoilage, they saved seeds, dried herbs, salted meat, and fermented fish. These traditions coexisted with new methods, a bridge between survival-based diets and modern abundance. Food now became not just survival, but convenience. People could plan ahead, they could store surpluses, they could travel without fear that their meals would spoil. The anxiety that once dictated every choice, the constant question, will it make me sick, diminished. Hunger was no longer a daily companion for those with access to preserved, industrial, or transported foods. But safety didn't eliminate scarcity entirely. Natural disasters, war, economic crises, and inequality still created risk. Food became safer for many, but the global population still experienced hunger, malnutrition, and famine. Humanity learned, slowly, that safety wasn't just about chemistry. It was also about social organization, storage, transportation, and equitable access. The change in perception was profound. Food could now be trusted, or at least, more often than not. People could plan meals without fear. They could celebrate abundance. They could enjoy flavors that once would have been impossible to risk. And yet, memory of the past lingered. Recipes, habits, festivals, and social norms retained traces of centuries of danger. People still valued preservation, cleanliness, and caution. Modern food systems, supermarkets, refrigeration, year-round produce, packaged and labeled goods represent the culmination of centuries of incremental improvements. What we now take for granted, the ability to buy milk that won't sour overnight, fish that won't reek in summer, bread that won't poison, is the product of human ingenuity, patience, and risk management over millennia. The slow arrival of safe food also reshaped human culture. People began to eat, not just for survival, but for pleasure. Sugar, chocolate, exotic fruits, spices, they became accessible to more than just the elite. Recipes became creative. Meals became social, celebratory, and varied. And most importantly, the fear that once underscored every bite diminished. Yet safety has a hidden cost. Modern food distances us from the reality of survival. We forget what people endured to eat, what risks they took, what knowledge they required just to avoid sickness. Hunger, spoilage, monotony, and smell shaped lives in ways we can barely imagine. And even today, the fragility of food systems reminds us that abundance is a relatively recent, highly engineered luxury. In the end, the slow arrival of safe food is a story of human resilience, ingenuity, and persistence. It's a story of chemistry, technology, and social organization. It's a story of learning from centuries of failure, adaptation, and hard-earned survival. And it's a reminder that what we take for granted, the simple confidence that our food won't kill us, is the product of thousands of years of incremental progress, struggle, and careful observation. When we eat today without fear, without checking for spoilage, without rationing or worrying about parasites, we are benefiting from countless generations who endured, experimented, and slowly, painstakingly, transformed a dangerous world into one where food can be trusted. Food didn't become safe overnight. It was a gradual, uneven journey, and the memory of the risks, the smells, the monotony, the hunger, those lessons remain, faintly, in the way we value abundance, convenience, and variety today. Safety may feel normal now, but it is, historically, a miracle. And every meal we enjoy without fear is a quiet tribute to the long, complex, and sometimes dangerous history of what people ate before modern food. Take a look around your kitchen. Shelves stocked with colorful packages, refrigerators humming with milk, eggs, meat, and fresh vegetables, freezers packed with frozen meals, fruits, and ice cream. Open your pantry and count the variety of grains, pastas, and canned goods. Look outside and notice that supermarkets carry fruits and vegetables from every corner of the globe, all year round. Now, stop for a second and imagine this. For most of human history, this would have seemed utterly impossible. People lived in a world where food was seasonal, local, and unpredictable. A ripe tomato in January, unheard of. Bananas in winter, only a dream. Milk that didn't sour within a few hours, a miracle. And yet, here we are, surrounded by abundance, spoiled for choice, and largely ignorant of how fragile it all really is. Modern food feels unreal because it disconnects us from history. Hunger, monotony, spoilage, and scarcity. Our ancestors lived with these constants. Every meal was a negotiation. Can I eat this safely? Will it be enough to last until the next harvest? How can I make a single grain of rice stretch for the whole day? The anxiety of survival hovered over every bite. Today, the only real challenge is deciding whether to microwave leftover pizza or make a smoothie. The contrast is jarring. Sugar is a perfect example. Once a rare luxury, worth more than gold in some societies, now it flows freely in nearly every product we eat. Salt, spices, exotic fruits all were symbols of wealth and survival, now ordinary commodities. Modern humans rarely appreciate that these flavors were once markers of status, hope, and even life itself. Eating sugar in abundance is not just indulgence, it's living in a world that has eliminated the uncertainty that shaped nearly every human meal for millennia. Our emotional distance from food is another reason it feels unreal. Most of us don't grow, hunt, forage, or prepare our own meals from scratch. Packaging hides spoilage, refrigeration slows decay, supply chains mask the seasons. Food arrives safely, predictably, and reliably. We rarely experience the tension, the judgment calls, the constant vigilance that defined eating for centuries. Our relationship with food is sanitized, controlled, and convenient. It feels almost fictional when compared with the realities of the past. The industrialization of food also changes perception. Meals are engineered for shelf life, flavor, and calorie content, often at the expense of freshness or nutrition. We consume more than we need, more consistently than ever before, without thinking about scarcity, seasonality, or preservation. That abundance is new, that reliability is fragile, that convenience is, in historical terms, miraculous. Yet, this abundance has psychological consequences. Because food is constant and predictable, we often take it for granted. We forget that people once endured monotony, risked illness, and rationed every bite. We forget that survival once depended on skill, knowledge, and vigilance. That loss of perspective makes food feel unreal, because we no longer remember the weight, the smell, and the labor that once accompanied every meal. Even the flavors themselves feel surreal. Exotic fruits and spices are cheap and plentiful. Frozen fish travels thousands of miles without rotting. Milk stays fresh for weeks. A banana today is nothing like the dense, starchy, occasionally spoiled fruit that explorers and traders once encountered. Our taste buds have adapted to abundance, yet the memory of scarcity is absent. Modern food is both familiar and alien, ordinary and extraordinary, simultaneously mundane and magical. Hunger's absence also changes our behavior. We eat not because we must, but because we want. Convenience drives choices. Pleasure dominates over necessity. Excess is normalized. We forget the discipline, patience, and ingenuity that made past diets viable. And because scarcity is distant, food has become both safer and emotionally detached. We rarely experience the tension that once made a meal a small victory. This surreal feeling extends to culture. Supermarkets, recipes, and restaurants allow global foods to coexist in ways our ancestors could never imagine. We can taste a mango from India, sushi from Japan, and cheese from France all in the same day. It's sensory overload, a dizzying contrast to the monotony and risk of historical diets. That variety feels unreal precisely because it is historically unprecedented. Yet, despite this comfort, abundance has hidden fragility. Modern supply chains are long, complex, and vulnerable. Disruption, whether from war, climate events, or economic crisis, can instantly remind us how dependent we are on systems built for reliability. The safety and variety we take for granted are the results of centuries of adaptation, innovation, and careful management. Remove those systems, and the world quickly returns to scarcity, spoilage, and anxiety. In essence, modern food feels unreal because it erases the tension that defined eating for most of human history. Hunger, monotony, spoilage, and scarcity are gone, or at least hidden. Calories, flavor, and abundance have replaced uncertainty, improvisation, and vigilance. We consume a world designed for comfort, without acknowledging the millennia of struggle that made that comfort possible. And yet, there's something to celebrate here. We can eat without fear. We can taste, experiment, and enjoy in ways unthinkable to our ancestors. Meals are no longer survival exercises, they are social, cultural, and personal experiences. Our abundance is the culmination of human ingenuity, trial and error, and adaptation. It is the victory of knowledge over uncertainty, science over chance, and civilization over scarcity. But perhaps the lesson of history is this: never forget that abundance is new, fragile, and deeply earned. Every bite of fruit out of season, every meal free from spoilage, every year-round supermarket visit is part of a story that stretches back thousands of years, a story of hunger, monotony, ingenuity, and resilience. That story shaped our ancestors, and it quietly shapes us, too. Modern food may feel unreal, but in understanding its history, we reconnect with the humanity behind every meal, the fragility behind every bite, and the ingenuity that allows us to eat without fear every day. It's a remarkable gift hand, one worth tasting slowly, thoughtfully, and gratefully. Here we are, at the quiet end of a long journey through human food history, from the empty hands and smoky dawns of prehistoric times to the monotonous pottage of medieval Europe, to the pungent markets before refrigeration, and finally to the abundance of today. We've seen it all, and the lesson is simple but profound. Food was never guaranteed. It was never safe. It was never just about taste. It was survival. Think of a simple meal today: a sandwich, a bowl of rice, or a plate of fruit. You don't worry about whether it will poison you. You don't wonder if it will be enough. You don't have to calculate how far it will stretch before the next meal. These are luxuries our ancestors could scarcely imagine. Every safe bite, every year-round supply, every snack at your fingertips is the result of centuries of ingenuity, trial and error, and endurance. And yet, that abundance comes with a kind of amnesia. We've forgotten hunger. We've forgotten spoilage. We've forgotten monotony. The struggle that once framed every meal, how to stretch it, how to preserve it, how to survive with it has disappeared from daily life. Modern food feels almost unreal because we no longer remember the danger, the patience, and the ingenuity required to eat it all. But remembering matters. It shapes gratitude. It shapes mindfulness. To understand history is to taste it, not just in flavor, but in context. Imagine bread that could kill you, a fish that might rot before dinner, a meal so monotonous you could name every ingredient by heart, season after season. That memory teaches perspective. It reminds us that abundance is precious. It reminds us that food is not just a commodity, is life itself. And there's another subtle lesson: resilience. Across continents and centuries, people adapted, they endured. Famine, spoilage, monotony, hunger as a weapon. They found humor in hardship, joy in rare indulgence, and innovation in scarcity. Their survival wasn't guaranteed, but their ingenuity was relentless. We inherit the fruits of that ingenuity with every safe, abundant, varied, and flavorful meal today. Eating without fear is not just a practical advantage, it's a cultural and emotional inheritance. It allows us to savor flavor, experiment with recipes, share meals with friends, and celebrate abundance without anxiety. But it also challenges us to remember, to appreciate, to be conscious that what seems normal today, milk that doesn't sour, bread that doesn't poison, fruit in every season, is a miracle of history. And in that remembering, there's gratitude. Gratitude for the abundance we enjoy. Gratitude for the knowledge and innovation that keep our food safe. Gratitude for the patience, humor, and endurance of generations who ate with risk, monotony, and hunger as constant companions. Gratitude that we live in a world where a meal can be something more than survival, a pleasure, a ritual, a social experience. So, the next time you open your fridge or visit a supermarket, pause for a moment. Look at the variety, the safety, the abundance. Taste it slowly. Appreciate it. Every ingredient carries a story. The risk once involved in eating it, the ingenuity that preserved it, the labor that produced it, and most importantly, the fact that you can eat without fear, a privilege humans have only recently claimed. Food is history's longest story. It is the story of survival, adaptation, creativity, humor, endurance, and finally, abundance. It is a story that stretches from the first root dug from the earth, to the first bread baked on a stone, to the refrigerated shelves of today. It is a story worth tasting, remembering, and honoring. And so, as night falls, as kitchens grow silent, as markets close and fires dim, remember, you are eating at the end of a long, extraordinary journey. You are eating safely, you are eating freely, and in that act, you are part of a history that is both ancient and ongoing, a story of life, resilience, and the remarkable human ability to turn hunger into hope, monotony into innovation, and scarcity into abundance. Eat without fear, remember with gratitude, and savor every bite, because it is nothing less than a miracle. As our journey through the past comes to an end, it's fascinating to realize how much food has shaped everyday life long before modern kitchens, packaged meals, or grocery store aisles. These simple ingredients and age-old recipes weren't just about survival. They were about culture, tradition, and community. If you enjoyed exploring what people ate before modern food, please give this video a like. It really helps support the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments too. Which historical food surprised you the most? Or which one would you actually like to try? And if calm, immersive history is something you enjoy, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss future videos. Before you go, Check out the related videos on your screen for more peaceful journeys through history. Thanks for watching, rest well, and I'll see you in the next story from the past.